Well, let me just quickly bring Mr. Onyekpere into this conversation. Thank you so much for staying with us, Mr. Onyekpere. Now, you heard his argument, his speaking on the part on agriculture and security, that the funds allocated to these sectors were, well, sufficient going by what we have, especially for agriculture, since now the Ministry of Agriculture has to a large extent began to run the sector like a business and not as it was previously. Let's talk about the judiciary. The funds allocated to judiciary in this year's budget, are they enough?
Whether the funds allocated to the judiciary is low. Well, if you look at the projections over the years, you will find out that the judiciary was almost at par with the funds allocated to the National Assembly. But over the years, the funds allocated to the judiciary had consistently come down, and then the funds allocated to the National Assembly has gone up. So if there's that complaint on the part of the judiciary that the funds allocated to it is quite low, I want to believe that is a truism, and more funds should be made available to the judiciary. Even coming back to agriculture that my colleague talked about, you look at agriculture, we are getting only 1.44% of the overall budget. Now, if you say that agriculture is being made a business, therefore there will be no need for subsidies, so that's why the vote is coming low. That may not be entirely true, because in very advanced countries where agriculture has already become a business, not just an aspiration, they are still heavily subsidizing agriculture. So if we want to copy, we have to copy well. If we have to develop new strategies, we have to develop it well. It's not a question of speaking big grammar about value chains. How does it impact directly on the farmers in the local areas, or even those who want to run mechanized farming? So I believe that the sum allocated to agriculture is very, very low. Even if you take beyond agriculture, some sectors like education, some sectors like health, you look at the entire vote to the sectors that are quite low. Admittedly, it's not even the issue of the overall allocation as a whole. If you even look into some of these sectors, you even see a lot of frivolous expenditure. So we should even be able to disaggregate further beyond the percentages to see what exactly is being demanded in each of the sectors, whether these are issues and materials that will, at the end of the day, help the sector to attain sectoral targets as we have in national policies.
Well, Mr. Onyekpere, let's continue this conversation if we can, and go back to another aspect that was actually raised by one of the lawmakers, one of the senators, in particular, Senator Olubunmi Adetumbi, to be precise. He argued that the budget had been prepared in breach of several laws passed by the Senate, and I'll quote him directly. It says, for instance, Section 18, subsection 2 of the Fiscal Responsibility Act says that the provision for the budget must be in conformity with the medium-term expenditure framework. According to him, this has been violated. Again, he says Section 33 requests that the Finance Ministry should provide monthly revenue estimates. This too has not been complied with. Mr. Onyekpere, you're a lawyer. What's your take on this?
Yes, if you look at the entire Fiscal Responsibility Act, a good part of the provisions are being violated. In fact, they've been observed more in the breach. The law clearly says that you ought to have an annual cash plan to be prepared by the Accountant General of the Federation. The law also said you need a budget disbursement schedule to be prepared by the Ministry of Finance. These things have not been done, and consistently, even when you have the MTF, sometimes there's a variation between what you have in the MTF and what is there in the annual budget. But the law says that the MTF should guide budget preparation and budget approval. So in essence, I quite agree with you. The law has been more obeyed in the breach, even bringing out budget implementation reports. They are not brought timelessly. The last budget implementation report you have on the website of the Budget Office is that of the third quarter. It was just brought about a few weeks ago. That of the full year is not yet there. So a lot of the provisions are there. They are just tucked up in the shelves and nobody's looking at them.
Well, Mr. Onyekpere, we'll come back to you in just a moment and continue this conversation. I still have Mr. Johnson Chukwu here with me in the studio. Another issue that Senator Adetumbi actually raised, apart from that legal aspect, was the fact that the revenue gap as our expenditure side is quite huge, and because of this, Nigeria will continue to borrow. Is it also unfounded, or is it in line with what we're seeing?
Well, the fact is that our revenue stream is declining, principally because we're having a lot of losses from oil exports. You'll find out that because of the pipelines are being breached, because there are a lot of shutting as a result of activities of oil thieves. So you find out that we are not able to produce. Currently, we are producing about 1.8 million barrels per day. The budget is predicated on 2.39 million barrels per day. And if you look at that shortfall, and that's where the revenue shortfall is coming from. But because the government has to achieve certain level of expenditure, so when your revenue is declining and you have to maintain your current expenditure profile, you are going to have a gap. And that's where you're having that gap, where you're having that shortfall that has to be funded from borrowing. So the only way to address that, because when I look at the challenges, the fiscal challenges we have in this country, it is not necessarily because oil price has dropped. Maybe ultimately in the long run oil price will drop, but today oil price is still doing above $100. The budget is predicated on $17.5 per barrel, but we are not able to meet our production target of 2.39 million barrels per day. And that's where the shortfall is coming from. And that's what Senator Adetumbi was saying, that we are having a reduction in fiscal revenue or federal collected revenue, while as our expenditure. If you look at the budget was actually a reduction from the previous year's budget. Previous year's was 4.9 trillion. Now we're talking of 4.643 trillion. Okay, that's almost a 300 billion reduction. And if you look at that, you also saw that there was a reduction in share of capital expenditure. Capital expenditure is now 1.1 trillion for 2014. Basically because the overall revenue of the federal government is decreasing. And the previous year's budget was predicated on 2.53 million barrels per day. We're now talking of a projection of 2.39 million barrels per day, whereas our production is only 1.8 million barrels per day. That's where the challenge is. And that's why we have to continue to borrow. So I think the challenge the government has to address is how do they curtail the level of theft and loss of production in the oil industry.
And not only that, how to determine how much should be borrowed, because there was once upon a time the debt management office said, we can actually borrow. But then it calls to reason that we're trying to, as much as possible, reduce how much debts we incur, not look for ways to try to add to it. And that's what it seems will most likely happen in the long run.
Yeah, as long as we continue, our production is declining or remains at current 1.8 million barrels per day. We have to meet the projected expenditure of 4.6 trillion, then we have to borrow to cover the shortfall. And that's what the challenge is this. We're now borrowing to meet consumption needs instead of borrowing for capital expenditure. Like what the Minister of Works said, that the government is going to raise an infrastructure bond of 100 billion for the construction of Lagos-Ibadan Express Road. I don't have any problem with that kind of borrowing. The challenge we have is borrowing to meet the overhead, the recurrent expenditure of the government. And that's what we're going to get to if we continue to produce oil at current level. And that will mean that we're building up a debt profile that is not supported by accumulation of assets.
Okay, so how much of this budget now is actually going to support the driving force for it, which is supposed to be job creation and inclusive growth? Is it just a mere catchphrase, or are we actually going to see that happen?
Well, that's a very difficult question. It's saying that, look, if the budget is implemented to the letters, and some of the government, the government focus today is in import substitution. What the government has been doing, if you look at the government economic policy, is to substitute goods that are imported for locally produced goods, to redirect consumption of Nigerians from imported goods to locally made goods, by building those industries that produce those goods we import. If that is successfully implemented, you're going to have job creation, you're going to have more inclusive growth. Take, for instance, with the value chain, drastic change in the value chain in the agriculture sector. It's basically supposed to lead to a situation where most of the peasant farmers will be able to earn enough. The agriculture sector will create employment. Agriculture can account for about 41.9% of the GDP. That is using 1990 constant price index. So if agriculture sector is growing, you'll find a lot more people being accommodated in that sector. If you look at the transformation they're trying to implement in the manufacturing sector, currently the manufacturing sector accounts for about 3.58% of the GDP. The Minister of Trade said that the government's intention is to increase the share of manufacturing sector to about 10% by 2017. The manufacturing sector is always the largest creator of jobs in any economy. And the government has come up with a couple of things like the You-Win and You-Win program to attract young people, to reward young people, to motivate them to go to become entrepreneurs. So such sectors will create employment. But what will actually transform the economy will be a successful transformation in the power sector, in the energy sector. If that takes place, if the changes that we've seen in the ownership structure of the electricity industry is successful, you're going to see the small and medium scale enterprises come alive. And that's the sector that will create most unemployment. So if you talk of, are we going to have inclusive growth, are we going to have the transformation we're looking for, it depends on how successful the policies of the government are implemented.
Well, Mr. Chukwu, just hold on to your thoughts. Let's get back to you, Mr. Onyekpiri in Abuja. Thank you so much for staying with us. The House and the Senate are actually going to take a break. At least some members will be of the APC from the Senate and the House of Representatives will be traveling to their various constituencies to be registered, and so there's no sitting today and tomorrow. They should resume by Tuesday. At least that's the House should resume by Tuesday, and so they will begin to deliberate on the budget again. But just before that, yesterday, one of the lawmakers who actually raised a point of order said on the grounds that the budget estimates presented before the House reached Section 21, subsection 1, 2, and 3 of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And when he broached this, another lawmaker actually got up to contest that this was not breached in any way. And so the Speaker of the House of Representatives set up a 6-man advisory committee to look into this issue. Now, he's saying that the corporations, that government corporations listed under Section 21 shall not later than 6 months from the commencement of this act submit the estimates of expenditure for the next 3 years to the National Assembly. He has also said that the law required the Minister of Finance to cause and attach the estimates of the corporations, which are the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, CBN, NPA, and 21 others. But he's saying that these were not done. So if this was not done, how does this affect the way they're going to be deliberating on the budget, especially if a lawmaker actually said that all this was actually met, all these requirements were met before the budget was submitted?
Well, actually, the law is clear on what should be done. But in previous years, it seems that nobody has been looking seriously at the law. But I think it should also be no excuse for the delay in the consideration of the main budget. Whatever is required that had not been done, the Ministry of Finance should be in a position to forward them to the National Assembly. There are more fundamental issues that have not been complied with in the budget year after year, which the legislature has more or less ignored. If you look at the law, the same Fiscal Responsibility Act, it clearly says that the budget should come with the evaluation of the performance of the previous budget in terms of not just how much has been expended or how much has been utilized by the ministries. It should come with an evaluation report which shows the performance in terms of what has actually been realized with the money. If the Ministry of Health has been giving money, it should tell us how it has reduced child and maternal mortality and morbidity. If the Ministry of Water Resources have been giving money, it should tell us how many more Nigerians benefited from access to water by the expenditure of such sums, rather than telling us how many contracts have been awarded. Because in the past, what we've been hearing every time is the number of contracts awarded and not the results achieved. So I think whatever has happened should be able, the Ministry of Finance, if they demand of that, they should be able to give them the information while they continue with the debate on the budget. But that should not in any way stop the work on the budget.
Well, we'll quickly take a break now, Mr. Onyekpiri. When we'll come back, we'll continue this conversation. You just heard it for a while. We'll be right back. And Mr. Johnson, we'll also take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll continue this conversation. You're still watching Business Morning on Channels Television. And today on the program, we're looking at the 2014 budget and all the other issues that have actually come up at the Senate and the House of Representatives. We'll be right back.